Hey guys, Alex here. So today is going to be a continuation of Mid-Game Swindles. So this is going to be part 2. I hope you enjoy it. Hey, what's up guys? So this is going to be Mid-Game Swindles part 2. So today we'll be just continuing to cover on mid-game swindles and certain variations that you can probably learn and use, which will help mainly for your mid-game and perhaps closing out games. So let's move on to the contents and topics that we like to cover for today. So the first one is basically, for the lack of a better name, I actually called it an interior sandwich swindle. So that's how I like to call it. Different people may have different names for it, but I believe for the more experienced players, once you see the edge configuration for this type of swindle, you would immediately understand what I'm talking about. And of course, the second one would be 3 or 4 in a corner, wall and chip variation. So I'm going to be talking about 2 variations on that. And 3 or 4 in a corner is basically about gaining tempo while trying to capture moves or additional moves within a corner 4 box square. And then, of course, the third one would be a line control swindle. So this is also very powerful in terms of gaining tempo. So basically, that's what we'll be covering for today. So let's now first talk about the interior sandwich swindle. So over here in this situation, it is now black's turn to play, and you realize that due to how white has actually played out the edges in the mid game, black is only left with either moving into the pair over here on the left, or essentially x squares or c squares. However, black has this interesting edge configuration to the bottom. So it's basically 2 center black discs being sandwiched by 2 white discs, one on each side of it. And basically this is the interior sandwich swindle that I like to talk about in terms of how you can actually gain tempo based on that configuration. So right now, let's say if black were to choose to play into a relatively safe square in the form of a4 or a5, either one would actually immediately give up a move for white to just basically respond to it. So instead of doing that, what you want to actually do is perhaps to perform that interior sandwich swindle to try to make use of this edge configuration for yourself. So by the general rule of thumb, once an edge is actually configured this way, it's typically slightly more advantageous for the person or the color or the side who is actually capturing the inner part of it. So in this case, it is black, and also right now it's black's turn to play. So let's take a look at perhaps playing an early X square in this situation. So I know that at the start we learned that we probably shouldn't play an early X square to give up a corner to your opponent. But for this case, it's totally fine because it's giving up the corner and trying to gain tempo. So how is that so? Because it's against a wall or a semi-wall here that is hollow with 2 empty squares. So let's say if black were to play to b7 over here, the general response that you would expect from white is perhaps a corner for white to actually play into a8. And then basically black can then jump into b8. So even though black has essentially sacrificed the corner, black doesn't really lose out many stable discs because what white has gained in this exchange, this 3-move exchange in terms of a black, white, black, is essentially just 1 stable disc for white. None of the other discs are actually very stable at this point in time because black has essentially grabbed and extended its interior edge. So even though at the start, we've learned that corners are good, and basically corners are only good because if you can use are only good if you can use the corner to your advantage and just continue to extend the number of stable discs that you have that are adjacent to it. But in this case, there is 1 empty square that is next to it and 4 black discs that are probably not removable at this given point, and also not easy to actually remove. So essentially, By exchanging this black-white-black three-move maneuver, black has actually just given white one stable disc in exchange for a tempo. So initially it was black's turn to play, and black was stuck to play either x square or c squares. But because of black playing this x square and white capturing the corner, black jumps into b8. Black has essentially handed over the move to white to play. So in this case, when it's white's turn to play, you realize white can only play to the top, which are the legal moves for him. So if white were to play, let's say, b1 or c1 or d1, it would essentially open up easy moves for black to play, or safe moves. So if white were to go to b1, for example, black would essentially just jump to c1 and force a d1 response, and black could just go to f1, and probably that would be more than sufficient to actually end the game in terms of capturing the corner. Or basically, if white were to choose to go to c1, black could easily just jump into d1 for an easy centralizing move, and then look for moves to just end the game easily. So essentially, the point about actually performing this interior sandwich swindle is to try to gain tempo and try to switch up the move to your opponent. So let's consider a different situation. If we played this move right now as black, white, knowing that it might get swindled in that point, a pocket swindle over here in a mid-game interior sandwich swindle based on this configuration, white chooses to avoid playing to a8. But it wouldn't make sense for white to play to b8, because all b8 does is just give black the corner to a8 and just basically extend and sweep discs. So, of course, from a different angle, if you play b7, and white were to choose to play a7, so this would be more of a very defensive approach in terms of trying to retain parity in this zone. And of course, white would then give up the early corner to black, and white would grab the parity. So even though white does get this parity in this exchange in this region, but having black capturing the corner this early with some squares to play to the bottom right and some squares to play to the left, right down to the top left, is essentially probably not too great for white, because black can easily choose to play, let's say, a4 as a follow-up with a4 begging or a5 response, and black just goes on to actually sweep to a2 for a future sweep down to the x square over here to g7. So let's take a quick look. Let's say white were to continue with g1. Over here, black would then be able to still do an interior sandwich swindle of sorts by playing to g7. And you realize that there's no way for white to play a parity move to h7 as a mirror image, because black controls this line, horizontal line across on the 7th row, and it wouldn't make sense for white to play g8 to give up the corner and the sweeps, consequent sweeps to the right, up to the top right for black. So essentially, if white would just grab the corner again at h8, black can then jump in and do an interior pocket or interior sandwich swindle, and then you would have that same dilemma where white loses another move where black can consolidate and take parity. So white is then forced out of position to play one more move outside, where it essentially creates easier moves for black to just jump in and just sort of finish up the tempo in a forced manner. And then black could then just jump into h7 and force white to basically jump into b2. And black would then grab the corner and just do a clean sweep down and just secure almost 4 full edges just because of that interior sandwich swindle. So let's just go back to that earlier mid-game position and just try to understand a little bit more why this shape over here favors black so much in terms of an interior sandwich swindle. So in another way, other than attacking the b7 x square, black could even choose to attack the g7 x square instead. And of course, if white would choose to play the corner, because over here black is essentially controlling the entire 7th row, white doesn't have the h7 option available. So if white responds with taking the corner, black would then be able to just take g8 as a pocket or interior sandwich swindle. And this square is not playable by white. So essentially, with that maneuver, black forces white to just move out of the safe regions and is forced to actually play ugly moves to the top to create even more nice moves for black. And of course, you could argue that white could perhaps just take b7 over here and just sweep the entire row. But bearing in mind that when you have this suspended row of 6 discs with both ends squares in play, it would be very easy for black to actually just, say, do a corner and white defends the row. And once black just captures the edge, this would be totally reversible by black in order to just sweep back those discs. So if white were to just jump in, black would then be able to just successfully capture h7 and essentially do that interior sweep across and establish that strong edge. So with that exchange, you would then realize with that interior edge captured by black, these two interior white discs at b8 and c8 for white and h8, essentially they are nullified. So by performing this interior sandwich swindle, you could essentially nullify the effects of a corner. And of course, that also means that if you perform the right maneuvers, essentially you can win the game without capturing a single corner by nullifying your opponent's corners. And basically that is it. It's the interior sandwich swindle. So it's more about this edge play configuration and just trying to maximize the utility of these two interior discs. So let's now talk about 3 or 4 in a corner, both the wall and chip variation. So let's talk about the wall variation first. Let's look at this particular endgame sequence where it's pretty apparent to expert players that white is going to win, but perhaps it's not so apparent for beginner and intermediate players because right now white is pretty much forced to either x squares or c squares, or this pair at d1, which begs a response for e1 from black. So let's say if white were to just go into d1, and black captures e1 in response, essentially white would then be left with either x squares or c squares. So I like to talk about 3 or 4 in a corner. So a corner, not meaning the corner square alone, but rather a 4 box or a 4 square corner as such. And also there is one here as well. So when we talk about wall, what exactly is a wall? So if you have this continuous block of this, usually in the form of 2 rows, that is a wall. And of course, over here you also have another black wall. And of course, the top, you also have another black wall. So a famous player once said that you should also treat x squares pretty much just as every square on the board and consider it as a move. So typically we tell beginners and intermediate players not to do so because you don't really understand the concept of tempo. But once you've mastered the idea of tempo, you can pretty much treat the x squares or even the c squares pretty much just as the same as squares all over the board. It's more about just trying to use that shape to your advantage to actually gain tempo. So if we take a look at this situation here, we can start off with the 3 or 4 in a corner maneuver by playing an x square here. So if white starts off with g7, it's typical that black would have to respond to play into h8 and capture the corner because there is no merit for black to actually capture g8 or h7 because if black takes either one of g8 or h7, white just simply takes the corner. So definitely because of this move to g7, black has to respond to h8. So after black responds to h8, you notice that there are 2 squares over here, more like a pocket square. Because these are walls and they have continuous discs, it's easy for white to actually weave in and out of it by playing into, say, h7 right now. And you realize it's a pass move because there is simply no legal move for black. Because this was a wall and this is a continuous row of this, there isn't any flipping of this along this row. So white doesn't really create more moves for black per se. So after that, white can then take one more move to g8 and capture the third move. So why do we call this 3 or 4 in a corner? So earlier in that position, before we played out these 4 moves, you realize that this 4 box corner is actually after white, black, and white, you realize white has successfully captured 1, 2, 3 moves out of 4 in this particular corner box. So it's definitely very important when it comes to tempo, because what you essentially do is white has managed to play two more moves than black within this region that would essentially change up the tempo and force black to play a move elsewhere outside. And of course, if this were a mid-game situation instead of end-game situation, black would then have to play another move outside just to create more moves for yourself as white. So for this particular situation, if you were to try to apply the same concept that we learned earlier in the interior sandwich swindle, on top of this 3 or 4 in a corner swindle, is to play and extend towards G2, and you realize that black only has the option to take H1 or H2. H2 doesn't really make sense because it gives up H1 for white and entire clean sweep. So essentially black would then play H1 and white would then be able to play H2, and black has to pass again, and white essentially is able to play the next move to G1 as well. So if you talk about the top right box corner of 4 squares, white went once to G2, black responded to H1, white grabbed H2, and it was a pass of move, and white managed to grab another 3 out of 4 in a box corner like that. And essentially gains a lot of moves, a lot of tempo, and also secures the parity and solidifies the discs that are in between. So essentially this maneuver also nullifies the effect of these two corners, also because the 6 consecutive discs in between these two corners are all white, and also by nestling with G1 and G8 being as white discs, these corners are essentially useless or rendered useless because there isn't any way to actually move across continuously. So right now, if white were to just close out the game, white could just simply play B2, give it a corner, white grabs B1, and then white gives up A7, black grabs the corner, and white would essentially just grab this one because it's a +8 -1, but no difference for this one as well because it's +8 -1 as well. So if you wanted to grab the edge, then you could just play this, and black would then take B7. So essentially white wins 40 to 24 in this situation without even grabbing a single corner, and therefore it's also called a no corner win. So now let's talk about 3 or 4 in a corner, or rather 4 or 5 in a corner, because this is a chip variation that we're talking about right now. So if let's say right now it's white's turn to move, and you realize white essentially has not much options left, at least not much safe options. One option that white could then explore is to actually play B7 right now. B7 is an X square, but it's also a momentary diagonal control that allows white to grab multiple tempo within the lower left region. So the lower left region is a 5 square region where white would then target to actually look to get at least 4 moves out of that region in order to force black to create more moves for himself outside, because right now white does not have a safe move outside. So let's say if white were to play to B7 right now, you notice that this is a momentary white diagonal control by white, and of course black would naturally play maybe say G4 to actually capture this E4 disc that would provide access for him to grab the corner. But in this case, white could then just jump into B8. So notice how white has already played B7 in this region and consequently plays B8. So essentially white has already played 2 out of 5 squares in this lower left region. And over here it presents a dilemma in this shape for black, because if black captures the corner right now, A8, white essentially is able to wedge in between and play C8. And you realize that this move to A7 is only exclusive for white, but not black. Black can not play that. And due to that, black would then be forced to play outside, such as E2. And white would then be able to capture A7 in the future. So essentially after this exchange, you would then realize white has essentially captured B7, B8, c8 and also a7 within this 5 square region, whereas black has only managed to play a8. And this consequent shape also wraps around the black corner to the bottom left and nullifies the effect of the corner. So essentially, white not only gains a lot of tempo, but white does not actually lose many stable disks to black. So this maneuver is very strong for white to actually execute in such a situation. So let's just move back into the earlier shape. So after white has constructed this shape, you realize black does not have an option other than to grab the corner, because if black were to play c7, black would essentially flip the b7 disk to black and allow white to actually capture the corner to a8. And if black were to choose to play a7, it wouldn't make sense as well, because white would also be able to capture the corner. So notice how this shape was constructed. It almost works like a stoner trap, but essentially you need to know that this has to be built against a wall. So the reason why I call it a chip variation, because it's not a perfect wall. There is one empty square to c8 that makes it an imperfect shape as compared to just a simple 4-disc box corner. So this is one shape that is very useful to actually learn, because if you're forced into a tough situation like this, you realize you may not have any stable moves, stable discs to actually play, and no safe moves. So if you were to play to b2 instead, with black having that corner access almost immediately, black would then capture the corner, and this would then be a parity region to the top, where black can just form a semi-pair over there. Even though it does open one move for white to a2, essentially that exchange in tempo is only one tempo. So white essentially only grabs 2 moves out of 3 squares exchange to the top left. However, if white were to play to the bottom, white would be able to gain 3 moves by doing 4 or 5 in a corner. So that essentially is the power of gaining tempo and such a maneuver in the chip variation. So if we just play it out in a natural way, you would then realize black would play this, and then white would actually be able to play to a7. Black goes to f2, being the safe move. White essentially just takes f1, and you realize that now, after this maneuver, black is essentially the one that is being forced to both either x squares or c squares and giving up corner to white instead. So I will stop here and then move on to the final maneuver that we would like to talk about in the mid-game variations. So let's now talk about the line control swindle. So I received many questions about what exactly is a line control. So in Othello, typically you can make moves flipping discs in a horizontal manner or a vertical manner or a diagonal manner. So one of the things that I noticed is this thing called line control that would actually give you a momentary control within the mid game, and then force your opponent to make awkward moves that would actually open up situations that is in your favor. So one of my favorite players to actually observe this happening is actually Ben Seeley of the United States. He is a 2-time world champion and definitely one of the most popular and the strongest blitz players I've ever seen in this game, actually, throughout my maybe 12 to 13 years of playing. So of course he is one of the main players that we all probably learn from. So this game situation is actually one of the blitz games that I picked up on Othello Quest application of one of his recent games that features line control. So over here, if we play back one move, white, who is actually that is actually being played by Ben Seeley, he actually plays a7, which is a c-square move. So this is somewhat of an unusual, uncommon move, because in this situation, for me, I might actually prefer to play maybe b1 for safety, and then try to give up b2, and then give up the corner to a1 and wedge to d1. But instead, he plays a7, which creates this continuous horizontal 5th row, which is somewhat of a diagonal, somewhat of a line control within the mid game, which is actually a very high level type of play. So you would realize then that you black actually has a few options to counter. So the typical counter would actually be black trying to capitalize on white's c square by playing behind it. And of course, if black plays a6, white would then defensively respond to a5. And typically in this situation over here, black would play a3 because if you play a4 and allow white to play a5, you basically lose moves and control immediately. So if you were to play a3, you notice that white can actually do another line control along this c column, this vertical line over here, where after white plays c7, black doesn't have a nice move to actually just jump right down to c8, or don't really have many nice moves over here. So essentially, black would then be forced to perhaps play a4, a2, and then followed by finding c8. So of course, with that exchange, white could then go to f7. So you would then notice that white again over here controlling this mini diagonal across from a2 down to f7 doesn't allow black to play a g8 move. And there isn't any nice way for black to actually find any moves because all the lines that are directed towards all the remaining open squares are all being controlled by white. So that is essentially what we mean about line control. So the line control swindle actually means that he takes up a key position such that he creates a line control and make it an awkward position for black to play. So let's say if you were to argue black trying to play a5 over here, then white would just simply form a pair and just go to a3 perhaps, and then would result in a very defensive shape for white. If black were to continue with c7, white could perhaps just easily defend it by playing to b1. And then black would still be stuck in a situation with being run out of moves. So I think this a7 move is very interesting. Another way is for black to actually explore a4, which if white were to play a5, essentially if black goes a6, you result in that same shape after all. So essentially this line control is very strong. So what black actually did that is actually being played by one of the stronger Japanese blitz players, Eternal 3Q, he went into a3. So interestingly, Ben actually, instead of going to a4, which almost seems like a response to actually just centralize, he goes for the continuous line control to c7. So he feels comfortable about controlling this fifth row without a threat for black to immediately play a5. So this is a very strong line control swindle. And because of that, even if black were to play, say, a6, white could easily defend the edge back at a5. And you would still result in pretty much the same situation whereby black takes this and then white potentially has control of the situation by just playing to f7, and perhaps black extends to g8. White could just feed off a4 and go for a Landau maneuver this way. So of course you might argue, what if black played a4 here? Then white would just simply go to a2 and still control this mini diagonal that results in black not having any move. So this is an extreme example of a line control swindle that is beautifully played by Mr. Ben Seeley. So that is a very interesting mid-game and a very high-level line control that perhaps offhand you probably wouldn't want to play a7 almost too immediately. And yet if you play out the follow-through sequence, you realize most of the playout has already been covered, even with this control of move. So after looking at a late mid-game swindle, let's take a look at an early mid-game swindle. So in this situation where white may play to f7 and try to look for consecutive moves from f7 to f6, in response, actually black has the option to actually play to c6. So this is yet another example of sort of like a line control swindle. So the objective of swindles is actually to make consecutive moves in the same area. In this case, black wants to take c6 to have this momentary line control across the fifth row, where white cannot immediately jump into c5 and centralize back. And instead, if white were to go to f6 to chase after the excess, black could choose to either further prevent that by playing e7 to maintain that line control, or black could simply just go in to the center at c5. And since black has been able to play both c6 and c5 consecutively within the same region, so that is somewhat of a line control swindle that allows you to play two consecutive moves and occupy a center position. So that might actually benefit you in the future as the game progresses. So with that, I'd like to end off this episode. And thank you very much for joining me. And I hope you enjoyed the episode. And I'll see you at the next one.